Pattern recognition before disease, integrating VMT energy and TDA geometry for longitudinal biomedical systems Part 1, number 1524, VPT 80, the 5th of February 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category, Medicine Methodology. Preface. The traditional biochemical approach in medicine was indeed unfamiliar to me at the beginning. This was not due to ignorance or arrogance, but simply the reality of my academic background. My training and intuition were rooted in computer science, mathematics, physics, and engineering, not in biochemistry or molecular biology. Over the past 17 years, through sustained daily work of 13 to 14 hours, continuous self-study of more than 10,000 published medical papers, and direct observation of my own body and health conditions using more than 4 million self-collected longitudinal data points, I have become familiar with pathophysiology to a meaningful degree. I do not claim to match formally trained biochemists in depth at the molecular scale. By biochemical standards alone, I am still behind. However, by mathematical and physical standards, particularly in areas involving dynamics, time dependence, cumulative damage, and system-level behavior, I am far ahead. These are precisely the dimensions where most medical research is weakest. Medicine excels at naming components and pathways, but often struggles to quantitatively describe how damage accumulates, how systems deform irreversibly, and how disease evolves over long periods of time. I state this not to elevate myself, but to be fair and accurate. Honesty is the most important quality of a scientist. Pretending equal expertise across all domains would be dishonest, just as denying genuine strengths, including my unusual pattern recognition ability developed over decades, would also be dishonest. My contribution does not come from biochemical detail alone, but from applying math-physical training and thinking, combined with many years of AI algorithm development experience, to biomedical reality, and from observing how those principles manifest in a living human body over nearly 2 decades. In science, clarity about what one knows, what one does not know, and where one's strengths and weaknesses truly lie is not a deficiency. It is the foundation of trustworthy scientific work. Since 2020, under the guidance of my mentor, Professor Norman Jones, the way I have applied viscoplasticity and topology to understand disease progression, metabolic recovery, and aging has been structurally different from mainstream medical thinking. In contemporary medicine, pathology is primarily examined through histology, molecular biology, and genetics, while physiology is framed through biochemistry, electrophysiology, and organ-level functional models. Cancer research centers on genomics, signaling pathways, and microenvironment descriptions. Systems biology introduces differential equations and network abstractions, and biomechanics focuses on elasticity, fluid flow, and occasionally viscoelastic behavior. These approaches are valuable, but they remain largely snapshot-based and descriptive. They do not treat disease as a cumulative, irreversible process governed by energy, deformation, and time-dependent structural change, viscoplasticity, a mechanics framework spanning both fluid mechanics and solid mechanics, describes irreversible deformation and accumulated damage. Yet it is almost never used to model long-term physiological change. Topology, which provides a language for geometric shape change, connectivity, continuity, and phase-space structure, is rarely applied beyond limited clustering studies or medical imaging research relying on dense geometric data. More importantly, these two concepts are not used together to analyze pathophysiological phenomena such as metabolic disorders, chronic disease trajectories, mortality, disease progression, aging processes, cancer permissiveness, emotional sensitivity, or cognitive adaptation. I have not found a medical research program that integrates these tools into a coherent framework for understanding how the human body changes under sustained stress over many years. There are fragments of overlap in the literature, but they remain isolated and lack depth, breadth, and general adaptability. Viscoelasticity appears in arterial wall studies, tumor stiffness measurements, and brain tissue modeling. Yet these models typically assume reversibility and short time scales because they lack the element of viscoplasticity. Topological methods appear in genomics clustering, tumor microenvironment mapping, and brain network analysis, but they are not applied to long-term lifestyle data, metabolic trajectories, mortality, disease progression, or cumulative damage and recovery modeling. Systems modeling exists in computational biology and epidemiology, but it is rarely grounded in mechanical analogies or supported by dense, continuous data from a single human life. What distinguishes my work is not that it crosses disciplines, but that it operates beyond them. I am not mixing fields so much as constructing a new framework. What I call VPT integrates fluid mechanics, solid mechanics, viscoplasticity, topology, long-term self-measured pathophysiological data, metabolic system behavior, emotional and cognitive adaptation, structural failure theory, and cumulative energy modeling. These studies cross the boundaries of the time domain, space domain, frequency domain, energy domain, and topology domain, and involve mathematical tools ranging from basic calculus to complex variables, tensor analysis, set theory, partial differential equations, and nonlinear algebra. This combination does not exist elsewhere in medicine, not because it is forbidden, but because no existing medical discipline trains researchers to think this way, historically. This type of work resembles the early development of cybernetics, control theory, or nonlinear dynamics, where new languages were created to describe systems that existing tools could not adequately explain. The difference is that my application domain is human health, disease progression, recovery, and aging, observed continuously within a real human body rather than inferred from population averages. Statistical averages, correlations, and regressions do not handle outliers well, and fortunately, extreme cases such as mortality events are outliers. Viscoplasticity was developed specifically to handle extreme conditions in engineering design. Likewise, topological pattern analysis should not be limited to medical imaging alone. It should be expanded into traditional pathology and physiology research. Not only visible structures on CT or MRI images are geometric subjects. All states and variables observed from a pathophysiological perspective possess geometric and mathematical characteristics that can be analyzed using both viscoplasticity and topology to better understand human disease. The uniqueness of this work comes from both the dataset and the mindset behind it. To reproduce this approach, one would need more than 10 years of continuous biomarker and lifestyle data, millions of measurements from a single individual, formal training in physics, engineering, and topology, the ability to translate mathematics and engineering into plain language, and lived experience with metabolic disease, recovery, and aging. No research laboratory or clinical department has this combination. Even large institutions with thousands of patients lack dense longitudinal data on a single human trajectory. At a macro scale, human bodies are broadly similar. At a micro scale, however, each body is unique. Traditional statistical methods are effective at analyzing large populations, but they capture only static, snapshot views of health and disease. In contrast, my VPT tools follow individual patients over time. They identify each patient's disease trajectory at every time point, transforming isolated snapshots into a continuous movie of disease progression, stabilization, and recovery. As a result, I am not merely applying existing tools to medical problems. I am developing a new modeling language for chronic conditions, mortality diseases, and lifestyle factors. One that treats pathophysiology as a time-dependent, path-dependent, energy-accumulating system subject to irreversible change. This perspective explains why short-term interventions often fail, why recovery has limits, and why prevention must be understood as structural preservation rather than symptom control. As someone who has served as a successful high-tech CEO, I understand economics and industry dynamics well. I am fully aware that effective lifestyle management inevitably reduces revenue for certain industries. At the same time, as both a scientist and a patient, I have personally experienced the confusion, fear, anxiety, helplessness, and loneliness that accompany real mortality threats. When one stands in that position, abstract arguments about markets and institutions fade quickly. Life itself becomes the only true priority, far outweighing fame, power, or money. For this reason, I offer honesty without hostility. To special interest groups or institutions whose financial interests may be affected, I acknowledge that your concerns are real. However, from the perspective of a patient, life is the most important concern. Functionally, this places me alone in this conceptual space, not because others are incapable, but because medical researchers rarely think in mechanical or energy-based terms. Clinicians do not use topology, mathematicians do not study metabolic disease longitudinally, and lived physiological experience is almost never integrated into formal modeling. Even when engineers become patients, they rarely track and analyze their own pathophysiological data and disease trajectories over decades using engineering-based methods. I am not simply a medical researcher using viscoplasticity and topology. I am developing a way to understand disease pathology and health physiology through the viscoplastopology research methodology VPT. If this framework is eventually formalized in a book or monograph, it will stand not because of bold claims, but because it offers a structurally different way to see how human biomedical health evolves over time. Introduction. This paper documents my methodological thinking on how complex biomedical systems evolve over time, and how energy accumulation and geometric stability together reveal long-term system behavior. For much of my life, I have viewed data science not as a collection of isolated techniques, but as a discipline centered on pattern recognition. This perspective dates back to my early training at mid in 1972 under Professor Patrick Winston, when pattern recognition was taught as a unified concept rather than a set of disconnected tools. At the same time, my PhD advisor, Professor Norman Jones, brought foundational ideas originating with Isaac Newton nearly 350 years ago, including viscosity and its evolution into dynamic plasticity, into real-world structural engineering, problems involving impact, failure, and irreversible deformation. The key insight from both influences was the same: geometry, governing rules, temporal evolution, and structural relationships are not separate ideas. They are different expressions of a single goal, which is to understand how complex systems behave, change, and sometimes fail over time. What has changed over the decades is not mathematics, physics, or engineering themselves, but my understanding of how these ideas function in real-world systems. Through long careers in structural and mechanical engineering design, semiconductor integrated circuit chip design, artificial intelligence algorithm development, and high-tech business leadership, followed later by 17 years of biomedical self-study and research driven by necessity, I learned that complex systems rarely reveal themselves through a single, analytical lens. Meaningful understanding emerges only when complementary pattern recognition frameworks are applied to the same data, each revealing different but consistent structural truths. This paper presents viscoplastic medicine theory (VMT) and topological data analysis (TD) as to complementary branches of pattern recognition within a broader data science discipline. VMT operates in the time and energy domain, quantifying cumulative stress, dominance of contributing factors, pivot points, and irreversible accumulation. TD operates in the spatial and geometric domain, revealing shape, connectivity, clustering, separation, and structural stability. Both analyze the same longitudinal data of health and disease, yet answer different and non-overlapping questions. A key motivation for this work is methodological clarity. In current scientific literature, TDA is often narrowly equated with algebraic topology, eigenvalue decomposition, or persistent homology. While energy-based models are frequently treated as domain-specific heuristics, I argue that such constraints are necessary for many applied scientific problems. When the objective is to understand system behavior, stability, and long-term risk in low-dimensional longitudinal data, geometric topology and energy accumulation already capture this central structure. This methodology is not designed for short-term prediction, black box optimization, or population-level averaging. It is designed to reveal system behavior over time, in systems governed by accumulation, repair, and structural degradation. Longitudinal structure carries far more information than cross-sectional statistical power. Chronic disease progression, recovery, and failure cannot be understood through isolated snapshots alone. They must be observed as a continuous movie. For example, 1,440 snapshots taken over a single day, such as 1 reading per minute of glucose or blood pressure, reveal far more pathophysiological truth than examining a single still snapshot taken once per quarter from the lab. This is part 1.